Dear reader, if you're anything like me, you probably had a very distant grasp of what history is. When I was in high school, I don't know that I really took history seriously in terms of an attempt to truly understand what it was about in my relation to all of the individuals being described by history. It didn't feel at all like it was about people that I could really imagine as real in the same way that I am real. There was a yawning chasm between myself and those who I was hearing about. And I wanted to get another sense of history, one that emphasizes the connection between all of the major events and all of the major figures throughout history. There are so many history books. I've read plenty, but very often they focus on particular times in history, and reading those is fantastic. You can learn so much about the citizens, about the economy, about politics. You can learn so much about the habits of human nature and how those habits seemingly repeat again and again in various different contexts. But I wasn't feeling that I had a good understanding of the ways in which those distinctive textures across different cultures actually connected together into one larger tapestry. And I wanted a book that really kind of brought that home, that we do not exist in a vacuum. Our culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. Ourselves, our sense of self, and our sense of goals and motivations and desires, the access to resources that we have, that does not exist in a vacuum. There is a constant interrelation between people that has to be happening in so many cases throughout history. And the portions of humanity that was in isolation, of course, after a certain period of time, they lose that luxury and they become enmeshed in the broader schemes of whatever these other larger, perhaps more imperial nations desire. There are quite a few books that cover that broad overview of history. There's The Penguin History of the World by J.M. Roberts. There is The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant, which I actually have all 11 volumes of that, and I'll probably read it eventually. But I actually wanted a kind of world history that was much more narratively focused and, in that sense, character oriented and simplified in some ways. That maybe initially seems like a mistake to desire in terms of history. To just get a narrative focused history is to subject yourself to the whims of narrative, to the ways that narrative requires certain constraints on what can be spoken of. It limits some of the nuance that could be described in terms of people's choices, in terms of what is being written about. But I actually just wanted to feel history. This book is called The World, A Family History by Simon Sebag, Montefiore. And that subtitle really kind of gives away what is so interesting about this book. It goes to that structure of a narrative history, of zooming in on major characters throughout history, kind of the top-down view where you have these famous figures in power. It's not a social history, which has become the trend of late, which again is perfectly valuable. The social history is much more focused on citizens and the material conditions that surround them and the social constraints that abound throughout any one culture. That is all well and good and really interesting. But this book is much more focused on the major figures in history and their choices, and most importantly, the pressures that were building around them, the foundations that were there prior to their existence, specifically the foundations of family. What is so compelling about this book, what I really enjoyed when I was reading it, is that it was not just giving me the major figures as soon as they're born and then all of the accomplishments that they end up pulling off. It instead gives me their parents, their siblings, some of the other surrounding figures, perhaps the servants who were hugely influential, perhaps the uncles who had a major influence. And it was giving me some of those elements of luck that surround people, not just the elements of luck in terms of a battle that gets won over some minor decision that one wouldn't expect to actually work out. Instead, what you get is elements of luck in terms of the kind of upbringing that you have and how much your family truly affects the destiny that ends up unfolding. And this book is just a series of snapshots of families and how they build up certain figures, and then also what happens after those figures are gone. And it gives this really wonderful kind of sense of a whole ocean of different kinds of waves of lives. These lives where they're rising, you have the rising action of plot of their lives sort of building up. You have these climactic scenes in these moments, but then also the denouement afterward, wherein all of the consequences are now affecting those around them. And in that sense, the book feels so literary to me. And that was something really refreshing. It was exactly what I was hoping for, where I was feeling as if I was connecting with these figures in history, and I wasn't just viewing them as names to memorize. I was starting to think of them really as complex, odd, vicious in some cases individuals whose world is much like my world, in the sense of their internal world, in the sense of the kinds of passions that drive them. It made it easier to understand the ways that, had I been born in a similar place with a similar family and similar pressures, I could be compelled in similar directions. We are more like these figures of history than maybe it can feel, because of the long stretch of time that separates us, and especially the long stretch and distance in culture and what we take for granted as morally right and morally wrong. And this book, being a family history, also brings in the pressures of legacy on a lot of these figures. You have characters like Genghis Khan who already have a figure who existed before them, who had a legacy and a kind of expectation around that legacy long before someone like Genghis popped up. And then what you have here is a person moving with that momentum that was already there. And that's something that we could easily miss, the ways that there is a kind of set of expectations on these major figures. It's not like they become great simply on a whim. It's much more, rather, there's so much expectation built up that kind of propels them forward. It's almost like for some of these figures, their lives were orchestrated toward greatness in some cases. But then it also contrasts nicely with the more exceptional figures who end up rising up in far worse conditions. And you get to just sort of feel that difference between those who already had a built-up foundation of so much good luck, and then the ones who actually really had to push out of that bad luck that they were born with and actually try to find a way forward for themselves and actually make a name for themselves. The way that this book was written was especially striking to me, and actually the thing that I want to emphasize the most. It's extremely dense, the way that it's written. It goes through an actual worldly history. You're not going to get strictly the European side of things. You're going to get a history of portions of South America, of different parts of Africa, especially later on when there's all of these colonies being built up throughout the edges, the coastlines of Africa. You're going to get a history of, a brief stint of history of Australia. You're going to get the history of Hawaii. You're going to get the history of Haiti and its revolutions. In fact, you're going to hear about waves of revolutions, from the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And it almost has this feeling of like influence ebbing and flowing throughout the different parts of history, and the ways that each of the cultures within history are connected in some way, at least by little taps of connection along the margins. But it also ends up having just a literary quality in terms of how it's written. I can tell as I read this book that Simon Sebag Montefiore had experience writing novels for a time, because as he describes these characters, he really kind of focuses in on the hurt and the inner turmoil and the ambition and all of the ways in which the humans are kind of walking a tightrope of life and trying to stay in balance towards some kind of greater end. And that in itself is a constant wavering struggle. In that way, the density of the book can be tough sometimes. I found that it was a thick book already. If you look at the book, it's 1,300 pages of dense text. And it's going through history so fast in such a way that you even have like decades passing, paragraph by paragraph by paragraph. But if you allow that to sink in, if you allow yourself to slow down and just enjoy the length of the book, which I do think you have to voluntarily choose to enjoy that, because otherwise it's going to get very tiring. But I forced myself to just slow down and just enjoy it. If you do that, I do think that the book really pays off. Every paragraph is meticulously constructed, and it feels like it was gone through numerous drafts of very careful word choice. In spite of its density, it feels like this author really wanted to have variety in his diction to make sure that every flow of these storylines that he's cascading one on top of the other is feeling like it's constantly moving forward. He does this literary technique of like the back at the farm technique where he will follow one character as the tension builds and builds and builds, and then he will break away to another character as their tension builds and builds, and then break back to that other character. And so it feels like you're following multiple storylines at a time. And again, this adds to that density element that I'm talking about, where it felt like for a while I had to really write down a lot of the names and organize them for myself because there are so many names happening so fast. But that, again, if you embrace it, if you volunteer for that kind of density, it really ends up enjoyable. And it goes back to what I hoped for. I wanted a broad view of history, an outline of history, just so I can have that sketch of how people are connected across time. And by the end of this book, I felt overwhelmed with that connection. It felt to me so integrated, the different lives of all of these figures I had otherwise heard about at a distance. And I'm so appreciative of the work that this author had put in that I just had to talk about it. I'm sure you've seen it on bookshelves being advertised here and there, but having actually read it, I really found it to be encyclopedic in its range and literary in its density and careful in its emotional weight and consideration of contingencies surrounding figures. I really found this book a work worth taking the time to appreciate. As far as broad overviews of history goes, which I know is not the trend nowadays, it is so nice to read a book that tries to be narratively focused and literary and human through and through and through. And that's exactly what we get with The World of Family History by Simon Sebag, Montefiore. I really enjoyed the book, and I think that you will probably enjoy it too.